Welcome back to the FOI review series. Right now, we are working on Task D, which will be assessment and critique. Now, without further ado, let's just kind of dive straight into it. So, I've separated this. If you follow along with your PTS here, you'll see that part 1 of Task D is assessment and part 2 is critique. I've gone ahead and divided each page into each part just to kind of help separate everything, since it seems to get a little bit wordy if I just kind of jump it all together. So, 1A, let's talk about the purpose of assessment. Well, we assess students to determine how far along, how well they're doing in our course. We assess students to see if they're failing, if they're learning, if they're passing, what's going on with the student. A good assessment is going to give students practical and specific feedback, and it's going to help guide instructors on what to do with that student. A good assessment is going to tell you where the student is lacking or deficient and what to do about it. Now, we talked about what a good assessment will do, but what are some other characteristics of a good assessment? For this, we use Fast Cocoa. A good assessment is flexible. It's able to meet the needs of the student at different points and fit the tone of the training. Is the student on the verge of failing and they're terrified, or is the student kind of lackadaisical and they're just moving along through the training? The type of assessment is going to depend on the situation the student is in. Next, an assessment is going to be... I thought I actually swiped up. I'm so sorry about that there. I wrote acceptable and I thought the screen was recording, but an assessment is going to be acceptable. The student has to accept the teacher. If the student doesn't accept the teacher, the assessment doesn't matter, because the student's not going to take anything away from the assessment. They're just going to sit there and be like, well, I failed it, who cares? It was this dude who I don't even care about who tried to teach me something. Whatever. Make sure they cover that. Next, an assessment has to be specific. I need to make sure that I tell the student what the test is on. We're going to make sure we evaluate something on the test here, specifically one thing. And the outcome has to be very specific. Rather, the student needs to be told where they went wrong. Don't just tell them they failed and then move on. Tell them what problems they got wrong, where they went wrong. Work through their thought process. It helps. Assessments are thoughtful. We can't just go, willy-nilly in there. We have to make sure we come out and like we said, the assessment is supposed to tell us deficiencies in a student's training. So if you come out of the assessment and you mock your student for failing it, you've done nothing. If anything, you've demotivated them, which, again, you're not emphasizing the positive, and you are not meeting a responsibility of an instructor. And shame on you for that one. Be thoughtful with the outcome of your instruction and your assessment, rather. Next, they're constructive. Sounds kind of the same as thoughtful, but it's the same idea. Don't just critique a student and tell them there's a problem. Give them a solution, or guide them towards a solution. Have them find it. Telling someone they fail and they suck does not motivate them and does not help them. Tell someone what to do and how to work through their problems. Next, it's objective. Our assessments need to be objective. They need to be straightforward. They don't need to be up to opinion. The assessment needs to have an honest outcome. And we need to make sure that we're not, how do I put this? We'll discuss this in a moment with traditional assessments, but we want to make sure we're getting the same outcome for the same performance, and we're judging students based on exactly what we have going on in front of us. Next, comprehensive. And this is where I was kind of slipping up earlier when I was talking about specific, right? I didn't necessarily mean specifically one item. More like we have to cover a comprehensive thing of range of items. Specific just has to do with the outcome, giving them specific feedback, right? Comprehensive has to do with the subject matter of the assessment. Cover as much as we can within reason. We're not going to just, test the hell out of a student's knowledge of the components of an ILS, when in reality we need to cover the components of an ILS, how they work together, what happens if one is out, what do we do when the approach if it doesn't work, etc., etc., etc. Keep it comprehensive, but keep it within the realm of reality, right? Finally, organized. We mentioned how lesson plans need to follow an order. Assessments are no different. Why would I test a student if I'm giving them, figure out some sort of order, right? Because if I'm trying to test a student on their knowledge of the traffic pattern, I'm not going to start with final, then move on to downwind, then cover base, upwind, and then crosswind, and then departure. Give them an order. Either start it at a certain point and follow that order in a circle, or start it at departure. Because typically, you start the plane takeoff at departure. Actually, I know I do. I don't know what kind of plane you fly if you don't. So, there is that. These are the characteristics of a good assessment. Let's talk about different types of assessments. We have two major types of assessments we want to cover here. Technically three. But one segues to the next, so we'll ignore that for now. Traditional assessments is how we're going to start here. A traditional assessment typically refers to a written test. Think traditional formal lecture, right? Traditional assessment. You're going to see a written test, kind of like the pre-solo test. And we do have some characteristics that we want to cover of a good traditional assessment. Now, to remember this one, think traditional Dr. Kovu. So, the first aspect of a traditional assessment that we want to cover is it discriminates. Typically not something we say is a good characteristic, but we want our traditional assessments to discriminate. We want to have a student who comes in, this test is able to tell us if a student is well prepared or well versed in the knowledge. A test that discriminates will tell us who actually knows their stuff and who doesn't. Next up is reliability. We want to make sure that We want to make sure that the test outcome is reliable. For the same input, it gives us the same output each time. It doesn't change. We want to make sure that the test is comprehensive, as we covered earlier. Don't just crush the student on exactly how every component of an ILS works. Start talking to them about the rest of the approach. Next, we want to make sure that our traditional assessment is objective. Sound familiar? We want to make sure that when a student puts something in, it's not being graded based on the instructor's feel that day. The instructor had a really bad day and screw this kid, I'm giving him an F. We need to make sure a good traditional assessment gives you the good outcome based on the input. And the mood of the instructor doesn't change anything else. We want to make sure it's valid. I don't know about you, but when I applied for college, I gave them my SAT scores. Some colleges take ACT, some take SAT, whatever. They'll accept SAT scores. If my friend writes me in a college admissions test, and I get a 100% on this college admissions test, and I apply, and I'm like, hey, my friend Bob wrote me this test, and it was great, and I passed it. They're going to look at me with one eyebrow raised and go, dude, are you kidding me? Who cares? That's not a valid test. That's how we look at it. A valid test is this test that's accepted by your peers, other evaluators, and the industry in general. Make sure you get a proper test that other people accept, because otherwise it's silly. There's no need. Finally, we want a usable test. This means our font is of a legible size. We're not typing the test out in wingdings, always a good start, and making sure it's maybe on a nice piece of paper and not like cardboard or something. Make sure your test is easily usable to your student. It's straightforward. It's not, whacked out in any way. It's fine. So, Dr. Kovu is going to be covering our traditional assessments. Let's erase this here and talk about authentic assessments. So, if a traditional assessment is more of a written assessment, authentic is going to be a real-world look at things. So some good processes you want to follow through an authentic assessment. Well, actually, let's start first. Authentic assessments tend to be real-world tasks. They're not going to give you hypothetical what if and how does this work. They're going to say, hey, this happened. What do you do? Typically, you might find this kind of oral or a free response, but students are going to generate responses from their own knowledge. They won't be given any options here. Now, a good authentic assessment has a student replay events, reconstruct what led up to them, reflect on what happened, and redirect this knowledge into what they can do better in the future. So, an authentic assessment is going to be given a scenario. They replay the scenario. They reconstruct what leads up to the scenario. They reflect on the inputs into the scenario, and they redirect what should have happened and what will happen if this scenario were to happen to them. That's going to be an authentic assessment. Next is an oral assessment. Oral assessments are the most common types of assessments. Now, to move rather quickly through this, oral assessments are composed of questions. We want to make sure that we're asking our students effective questions in our orals. So, for this, we have another acronym. Surprise, surprise, surprise. And that one is ABCAP. Effective questions need to apply to the subject of instruction. Don't ask them random stuff out of the blue. Ask them a question about what we were just covering. Why would you throw someone off like that? We want to make sure the question is brief. Don't ask a run-on sentence of a question. Get the point across and get quiet, because you got to wait for them to give them their response. Let's make sure our questions are centered on one idea. Again, don't mislead students and run everywhere with your question. Keep it brief, keep it on the subject, and don't start changing up the subject midway through. Keep it on one idea. Next, we want to make sure that our questions are adapted to the student's ability. I mean, this one should be pretty straightforward here. I mean, I'm not going to ask I'm not going to ask a private student the intricacies of the G1000 and the tilt rate and roll sensors and where everything is located, and if it fails, what happens and how do they work and why is there flat motor and so on and so forth. Whereas for a commercial student, I am absolutely asking them those questions, as they need to know where things are located and what happens when things go wrong. So adapt your questions to the ability, the experience of the student. And finally, we still wanted to present a challenge. Wow, I can't spell today. We still want to present a challenge to our student. We're not trying to overwork the student, but at the same time, we want to challenge them and push them. Because without a push, your student's not going to grow. And a student who doesn't grow in their knowledge isn't going to be a good pilot, because a good pilot is always learning. So, if those are effective questions and questions we do want to ask, what don't we want to ask students? More mnemonics. They never go away. Pot bit. We don't want to ask our students pot bit. That's going to be puzzle questions, oversized questions, toss-up questions, bewilderment questions. We've got... I am completely blanking right now. Give me a quick sec here. Irrelevant. Irrelevant. And if that was toss-up, this will be trick. So, a couple of these make sense straight off the bat, and a couple of them are a little bit easy to confuse with one another. So, let's review. A puzzle question is a question where the student doesn't even really quite understand what to do with the information they've been given. They were given this whole chunk of information, and then it just kind of doesn't make sense with the question they were asked. An oversized question, an example of that would be, and I'll get back to puzzle momentarily here. An oversized question is something that the answer is so large and so long, you kind of sit there as the student, you're like, really, dude? Did you really just ask me that? An oversized question, the example straight out of the handbook is, what would you do before a flight? I mean, there's a lot of things I need to do before the flight. I mean, literally all available information. Damn, dude, that's a big chunk. You know, you want me to walk through it all? I mean, we're going to sit here for a long time. Long time. Toss-up question. Again, the example out of the book I think is absolutely fantastic. What would you do first in an engine out emergency? Would you squawk 7700? Or would you find a place to land? I'm doing both. I'll do both at the same time. I'll punch in that code, and I will look outside for a place to land at the same time. As the student, you kind of get forced in this scenario, like, shoot, which one does he want? Which one does he want? And you put the students this mentality of what answer does my instructor want versus what answer is correct. And that's why toss-up questions are a bad idea. A bewilderment question is a question where the student just leaves completely confused. They don't even know what the question is. That's how horrible it was. You walk out of listening to a bewilderment question, you're like, did you even ask me a question, dude? What was that? Irrelevant questions are pretty straightforward. Ask your student questions that are relative to the topic at hand. Again, we talked about this with questions we do want to ask. Questions that apply to the subject are what we do want. Irrelevant questions are what we don't want. Don't ask them something unrelated to what we're learning. Keep it on topic. And finally, trick questions. Trick questions are bad because they make the student feel like there's this competition between them and the instructor. And let's be real here. You'll lose as the student. But you don't want a trick question to come up because your student thinks that they're kind of competing with you. And that's not the healthy learning environment we want to create. So a good example of that is like, what's the first letter of the alphabet? Is it A, B, B, A, C, D, or D, C? Right? It's this kind of like, it's formatted horrendously. Like something like that. Like, what's the first letter of the alphabet? Right? I actually even confused myself just writing that. So yeah, that would be an example of a trick question. So let's talk about bewilderment versus puzzle, because a lot of people get this mixed up. This is just going to be kind of a rote memorization thing here. Understand that bewilderment questions are what was the question? Was that even English? Like, wow, that's incredible. Whereas a puzzle question is more what was the info? So if I remember correctly, I think the puzzle question from the book is something like, what are the actions you would take if you were landing in a traditional wheeled aircraft with a weak left brake and a right crosswind and an uphill runway? We know what the question is. The question is asking us what would we do, how would we land it? But all of that info put together just confuses the heck out of us. Whereas the bewilderment question, I can't even remember, but the bewilderment question was a great one. And it talks about, if I remember from the book, it talks about high to low and cold altitudes and what you do in a cold climate, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's this whole mess. Bewilderment question, you don't even really know what it's asking you. It's more just a hot mess. So, those are our questions. And that is part 1 of Task D. That was part 1 of Task D. We've got purpose of assessment, characteristics, traditional assessments, authentic, oral, effective questions, and bad questions. Good stuff. Let's move on to critiques. So, first things first, instructor-student critiques. The instructor-student critique is when an instructor is leading a group discussion and the students are going to offer criticism of performance. Now, like any time you have a group going on, we want to make sure we keep a close rein on the situation. Students can and will ruin every scenario they can, so keep an eye on them. Student-led destruction. A student-led critique is going to be when a student is asked to lead a critique. Pretty straightforward. So let's say we're in a full class, couple of kids, and I show a lecture or a video. And the video was maybe someone talking about an accident that they were in and what happened to them. A student-led critique is when I pick a student in the group and say, hey, where did this go wrong? What did they do wrong? Tell me what they can do to do better. That's going to be a student-led critique. A small group critique is when you split up the class into small groups and each group will criticize an aspect of the performance. So, if you want to talk about someone who is in a CFI class and the CFI applicant is going to teach a short field landing lesson, the rest of the class is going to be split up into evaluating different aspects of this. One part can evaluate the organization, the other part can evaluate the confidence of the instructor, and the other part can maybe evaluate the, what's what we're looking for, how correct the information is, the accuracy of the information. So, it's a good way to remember that there. Next, we have individual student by another student. This is kind of a one-on-one critique. Think a peer edit. If you've ever had in your language arts or English class, you bring in your essay and you have a peer review and you swap papers with a friend. That's going to be an individual student with another student critique. Finally, my favorite, or next, not finally, my favorite is self-critique. After performance, simply ask the student, where do you think went wrong? Where do you think went right? Have your students self-evaluate and see what they have to think about the scenario. This is really good because it helps the instructor understand where the student is in their process of learning. And it helps an instructor understand how good a student's skills are for self-evaluation. A student who's unable to self-critique, I wouldn't want to sign off in solo. Because let's be real, if you're the only one in the plane, you have to be able to pick out problems and deficiencies with your own performance. And if you can't pick those deficiencies out with your own performance, I don't want you performing on your own. And finally, we have a written critique. A written critique is great because it helps an instructor or a student look back on the critique after the fact, and they don't have to do it all immediately, especially if there might be some emotions involved. A student has had a bad experience in which maybe they had to display a defense mechanism, right? They're not ready to learn in that moment. They're not ready to learn from their mistakes. So give them a written critique, give them some time, let them look back on it after the fact. So, with that is our critiques. Pretty quick to kind of blow through those there. We talked about written, self, individual student by another student, small group, student-led, and instructor-student critiques. We talked about our types of questions, our 3 types of assessments, characteristics of a good assessment, and the purposes of assessment. Well, that was Task D of the FOIs. I hope that was helpful. And right, up next I'll be covering flight instructor responsibilities and professionalism in Task D. Catch you in the next video.